So as you continue to sit here and kind of dissect this Colts season in hindsight and reflect on it a little bit and try to figure out where it all went wrong, where it is that this organization is going, where it is that this organization should be going, and we talk about guys like Chris Ballard and Gus Bradley and some of the players and personnel, the one that I find most difficult in that discussion to draw a definitive conclusion on right now is Shane Steichen. And while it's easy to look at the product on the field, which, by the way, let's be clear, on some level, the perception of that product has been exacerbated by that loss to the Giants. Like, the Colts, make no mistake, we're below average once again. But it's not like the Colts were consistently the worst team in football all year. It's just now become an accumulation of these late season mishaps that ultimately have us looking at a bigger picture here instead of just looking at one season, right? You can, of course, hold what we saw in that game and in this season at large against Shane Steichen. I'm certainly not saying you couldn't. At a minimum, right, you would have to add it to his resume. Even the most stout defendant of Shane Steichen, if they were being fair, would say, hey, this season happened. You can't ignore it. Like, that's just an undeniable fact. Where it is that I struggle personally in some of the dialogue that I'm seeing online is this idea that we have seen enough to come to a final verdict on where it is that Shane Steichen stands as the coach of the Indianapolis Colts. Like, for example, when we talk about a Chris Ballard, okay? Even if I, to some degree, disagree with the fan base in this sense about Chris Ballard, when you talk about firing him, I am not going to sit here and refute the fact that when you look at the deterioration of this culture from the golden age of where we were as compared to where we are now under his leadership, and you take into account the consistencies late in the season, the consistent kind of lack of aggressiveness in putting together the roster, like all the points that could be made for Chris Ballard, coupled with the results up to this point, he's now the longest tenure GM in football right now. Listen, I'm not going to sit there and argue against it. You have enough facts for me to say, hey, I can't say you're wrong. My nuance would be, hey, one more season of him, okay, we're not even going to go there because I don't want to lose you, okay? My point is that I'm much quicker to, let's say, agree with you on a Chris Ballard right now than I am on a Shane Steichen, because it's very important that when you make a major change, like firing someone is important as a head coach and a GM as well, but we're talking about the head coach right now. When you make a decision that important, that decision is going to have a ripple effect across your organization for multiple years. Like, that is not just you rip the Band-Aid off, it's over, and now you're on to the next thing, right? Like, you got to continue to deal with the aftermath of a decision like that. So you want to make sure that when you do it, you're in a spot where you're confident you've gathered enough information to where you're not making a hasty decision. And I don't think we're quite there yet with Shane Steichen. When I say there, of course, I mean I don't think we have gathered enough information to make a decision that we can sit here and certainly say in 5 years' time, if we were to fire him, that we'll be able to sleep peacefully at night. Like, I don't think we're there just yet. Now, at the same time, let's be fair. If this were the Colts court of law, right? The Colts court, and there was a case of blame that was being built against Shane Steichen by the prosecution, which is a lot of you guys in the comments section, I can really think of quite a few points that you could confront me with that would evoke a level of skepticism. Like, don't think for a second that I look at Shane Steichen and I don't see any red flags, but make no mistake, a red flag is a sign of a potential issue. It's not proof that the issue exists. And I know that maybe sounds like I'm trying to do a little bit of wordplay. I'm not. Listen to that again. Red flags are a sign of a potential issue, not proof that they exist. That's a very, very important distinction to make when we have the discussion about our beloved head coach. Now, of course, I'm going to bring up those red flags anyway, but I'm also going to make sure to couple them with kind of the other side of that discussion, with the goal of getting some of you to try to view this thing from both sides and then make a decision, as opposed to just make your decision on an impulse. Now, listen, your decision after the information that I give you may be the same exact one, or you may change your mind. That, of course, is you choose your own journey, right? That's not up to me. to make you change your mind. I can simply present you with the information. So we're going to talk about it all. But before we do, you know what it is. My name is Justin. This right here is the Behind the Bench Colts podcast. As always, ask anyone watching and enjoying the show, go ahead, shoot a like. It's going to help me get out to as many Colts fans as humanly possible. If you're on YouTube and enjoying the show, whether it's your first time, your second time, your 20th time, if you have not subscribed yet, we're trying to get to 3,000 subscribers, and the goal here is to really have an excellent offseason. One of the goals for me going into this year, when I reflect on the past year, is that, quite frankly, I didn't have a strong enough plan going into the offseason to cover this team. That's one thing I plan to correct this season. Will I correct it? Will I not? I don't know. But if you don't subscribe, you're never going to find out. All the audio listeners, leave a 5-star review. Let the people know how much you like the show. But most importantly, be civil in the comment section if you choose to engage. And yeah, right? That's about all we got on that front. Want to go back to the content because, as I said, there are red flags here with Shane Steichen. And I want to make sure that even if I disagree with you, or even if you disagree with me, that you understand that I'm viewing this thing holistically. It's not like I'm just ignoring things for my own personal bias. Like, I'm trying to take a look at the entire board here and then make the best decision with the information I have in front of me, okay? So one of the red flags for Shane Steichen that we have seen this season, the way he conducts himself with the media is something I don't love right now, okay? Like, I understand the benefits of keeping things in-house. You think about the media and the way they can misconstrue things and create narratives and cause noise within the building. I understand all of that type of stuff. But at the same time, in this specific organization, with the way things have transpired, with everything that's transpired, from the hush-hush all the way going back to Andrew Luck, really just injuries at whole, we have kind of been a little sketchy in the way we've communicated that to the fan base. I don't know. I just think, I speak for myself, and I think many of you guys, and I think it's the problem that us as a whole have a problem with right now. As fans right now of this team, we are tired of being treated like we don't deserve answers, particularly when the results that you are giving us in exchange for that don't warrant our trust. So you're looking at us and saying we don't deserve answers, but we're looking at you as a team and saying, not for anything, fine, if you deserve our trust. Right now, we at large don't feel like you deserve our trust, and the Colts, for the first time in quite a while, are in a spot where I think it's going to reflect their ticket sales. Technically, I don't know the numbers, but I certainly don't recall this type of outrage last season, the season. Like, I know we kind of freak out at the end of seasons, but this is the first time I'm looking and saying, wow, like people are fed up maybe on a different level than we have seen in recent years. Like, there's been a unifying of the fan base, and part of it, I think, has to do with an aggravation, not only of a lack of results, but kind of being treated like we're idiots to some degree. And listen, maybe some of us are, but we're not all idiots, okay? It's not like if you're Shane Steichen, you couldn't be more open with the media. It's not to say that you have to tell everything, okay? But look at the way a guy like Dan Campbell communicates with the media, wears his heart on his sleeve, is very open and honest, will try his best to answer a question that he's asked, even if he can't give all the details. Look at how a Mike Tomlin speaks to the media. I mean, I could keep going on and listing head coaches. You even look at the way that Gus Bradley, dare I say, answers the media when they decide to speak to him. By the way, did you just hear him? Just on a side note, he digressed real quick, saying that anyone who isn't embarrassed by the performance that the Colts just put on is probably not the type of guy that belongs in the Colts organization. Listen here, Gus Bradley, okay? Let me add on to that one piece. It's one thing to be embarrassed by the performance, okay? But I would dare say this. Sure, that's not the type of guy we want here, but we also don't want the type of guy here that has been embarrassed like that multiple times, and we've seen him not make the corrections as to avoid that embarrassment again. We don't want that guy as part of the organization either, okay? So, Gus Bradley, listen, that sounds all good and well, but it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black at some point, right? That's the saying? I'm pretty sure it is. Regardless of the fact, Gus Bradley, on one hand, to speak to that statement, has proven he is not able to do that, okay? Shane Steichen, on the other hand, well, it's not so cut and dry. Like, yes, you have this year's worth of sample size on Shane Steichen, but right now, in my personal opinion, it's being measured against a career's worth of sample size, one year of which is as a head coach of the Indianapolis Colts, which is a season that I'm not going to let be retold, at least from Shane Steichen's perspective, The Colts, the bottom had fallen out of that organization, okay? And he came back in, and the rookie got hurt, and Gardner Minshew, who was nobody's franchise quarterback, came in, and they had a 9-8 season, and they were pretty close to making the playoffs. Again, I'm just speaking from the standpoint of Shane Steichen. You can talk about the standard of the Colts as a whole. I'm talking about Shane Steichen, his role and his involvement in this organization. Last season was impressive to the point where he was a guy being talked about as coach of the year, okay? That was as the head coach of this team. So when I take that into account, I can't just look at this year and say that's the be-all, end-all. I mean, I was just watching Sunday Night Football, or rather Monday Night Football, in that great Detroit versus 49ers game, and they were showing Dan Campbell's first 24 games as the coach of the Detroit Lions, which is around 2 years, a little bit less. He was 5-19, I'm pretty sure, in those first 24 games. I'm going off of memory. It's not like I have a snapshot of what I looked at. I'm just referencing from memory. So spare me on the exact details of that. Point being is it wasn't very good. And then on that note, even the 49ers, who are a perennial contender, kind of on and off, they're a losing team this year. Kevin O'Connell is probably the favorite right now over in Minnesota to win the coach of the year. Don't forget, his second season as the coach of the Minnesota Vikings, far worse than the first season. They were 7-10 in his second year. And again, now he's a coach of the year candidate coming back into the third year. So it's not to say that that means that Steichen is going to have the same trajectory. All I'm saying is that it's something to keep in mind and something to give us a little bit of pause when we say, hey, let's look at this season and use it as this ultimate judgment day for Shane Steichen. Okay? So that's the first red flag that I do understand. But number two, Shane Steichen was responsible for drafting Anthony Richardson, which in of itself, of course, is not really a crime, particularly because we don't fully know if Shane Steichen, if that was his guy, or if it was just who he preferred between Anthony Richardson and Will Levis. If the option as the head coach, if you're talking to your GM, and ultimately the option wasn't there to trade up, and the powers that be were not going to let you do that, we don't know his rankings. For all we know, that C.J. Stroud was his number one guy, right? That's the point I'm trying to bring to you. He can only do the best with the hand that he's being dealt, with the options that he has on the table. So that is something to keep in mind. But regardless of that, if I'm to argue against myself, he still did sign off on that, and he was here to be a QB whisperer of sorts. So even if Anthony Richardson was viewed as a colossal project, the reason Shane Steichen was hired to be the head coach of this team was to be the guy that is able to take that young quarterback and mold him into something special. Now, just because he's a QB whisperer, that doesn't mean he was brought here to turn water into wine and walk on water, okay? Which might be the case and might be what they're asking him to do with Anthony Richardson right now in terms of turning him into a reliable franchise guy. But either way, whether it be due to the shortcomings of Steichen or the incompetence of Anthony Richardson as a passer, that right there is not an element of this team that has shown nearly enough progress given the reasons that he was hired to be the coach of this team. The thing is that I'm just looking at AR right now and I'm saying, hey, we know that this was boom or bust in terms of his ability when you're talking about making a pick. That was a risky pick from the Indianapolis Colts. And right now, let me just say, of course, he can prove me wrong. He can prove everyone wrong. The story is not yet written on Anthony Richardson, but if we're to be fair, we're leaning on the side of bust right now in a big way, particularly if his character is not all it was cracked up to be. And I know when the season's tumultuous, you're going to have rumors fly around and you don't know what's true and what's not. But ultimately, this is not exactly what it was that we wanted to see. We'd be lying. It's one thing to be patient. It's another thing to kind of say, hey, at what point are we letting the kid off the hook, right? And that's sort of the dichotomy here right now with Anthony Richardson. But again, Steichen holds the responsibility for drafting him on some level. We don't technically know who made that decision because it's a collaborative relationship between Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard. And while both of them do have to agree to make a decision, that doesn't, the reality is that one guy is likely to have more of a say than the other. Maybe one guy's, if you asked him what the absolute best idea was, it wasn't exactly what the other guys said. There was a level of compromise. And even if you both agreed to it, deep down, both of you know that really it was kind of the one guy that made that decision. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Because that's a very real thing. So I'm inclined, given all of that, to give Steichen the benefit of the doubt on that if Anthony Richardson is a bust. Another red flag while we're at it, he did decide to keep Gus. Not my best transition, by the way. I was trying to get to the next one, okay? He decided to keep Gus Bradley just broke the fourth wall there for a second. Decided to keep Gus, okay, which obviously that has been a mistake. And they gave Shane Steichen full reign over the staff. And again, wrong decision was made in keeping Gus Bradley. That is pretty clear. Now, maybe the decision to keep Gus Bradley, of course, was rooted in something tangible and real, like things like continuity and due diligence. But at the same time, he certainly didn't hesitate to make all types of other hires and changes on the offensive side of the ball. So, what can we say about that? It's not like he doesn't understand defense. Like the way football works, not that I'm like a football aficionado, but ultimately it's a game of chess on some level. So to understand offense, to be a high-level offensive mind, you do need to have an understanding of the defensive side of the football. So again, it wouldn't be fair to say that Shane Steichen doesn't need to know or doesn't know what needs to be done on the defensive side of the ball entirely. But the fact that he kept Gus Bradley around despite overwhelming evidence to not have him there is something that I can't really defend or really explain in a way that makes it feel whole. Like I could give some reasons where you could somewhat justify it, but nothing that really makes me feel like it was justified. Does that make sense? In hindsight, of course. Now, number 4, when we talk about red flags right now for Shane Steichen, and this might be the biggest one of all, Chris Ballard hired him, okay? And I know some of you guys who kind of come here because I give a fair take on Chris Ballard are going to knee-jerk reaction. Oh, now he's joining the Ballard hater side. Let me just be clear, okay? As far as head coaches go, we have enough evidence to look at Chris Ballard and say, hey, he may not be the best judge of character when hiring the head coach, at least in terms of hiring guys that will command the respect of the team. When it comes to that element and that element alone, hires don't get much worse than Frank Reich and Josh Daniels. And when you look at Shane Steichen, at least on a surface level, of course, there's nuance to this discussion, he is built in a similar mold to those guys. Offensive-minded, innovative, aggressive type of play caller, all that stuff. That right there is maybe the biggest indictment on Shane Steichen that there is kind of like a guilty by association type of case, okay? And that may not be fair, but at the same time, it's one that I'm thinking of, and I'm not sure if I've heard anyone talk about. But I will say this. You may call Shane Steichen like a snake oil salesman or something like that, but man, when you compare him to the other two guys I just mentioned, if I'm to be fair, go back and take a look, right? Go relive the pressers that he had after getting hired to be the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. That was a guy that came off as sharp. He came off as no nonsense, and he had a clear vision for this team. Like, he didn't come off in those pressers as many of us are portraying him now. He came off like a guy that was predicated on accountability, on setting a standard of winning. And sure, again, you can just say the right things, but all I'm saying is I believed him, okay? I believed him when he came in. And no matter how you look at it, if you ask me, whether you're on Shane Steichen's side or you're not, if we move forward with Steichen, which I do expect the team to do, we do owe it to him to give him the best possible chance to succeed in his role. Now, the question from there becomes, what does that look like? What does it look like to give Shane Steichen the best chance to win? Well, here's a couple of ideas. One, you got to give him more talent to work with. Whether it's the top end, whether it's top end depth or guys that are, high level players, you got to do something, right? Because it's hard to bench guys when some of the guys that you are already kind of positioned to have as your starters due to the roster construction are not exactly ideal pieces to build around. Like, it's not like there has been no accountability in this building since Shane Steichen has become the coach. Again, what I won't do is allow the story to be retold. You look at the end of the season last year, Isaiah McKenzie, Tony Brown, you look at a Darrell Baker Jr., even Dallas Flowers, which was earlier this season. Easy to forget about it now, but they cut him like that, okay? There's been disciplinary actions taken by this staff and taken fast at times, okay? But at some point, you do run out of the options. Like you can't just keep going back to the well. okay? And you can't just bench guys for guys that you know are objectively worse, even if those guys aren't performing well. There's a fine line there. And I'm particularly, by the way, looking at the cornerback room when I have this conversation. Like, sure, I like some of the guys that the Colts have at corner right now, but they'd be far better if they were all moved down one spot on the depth chart. You know what I mean? Anyways, next thing you would have to do to give him a fair shake, you got to bring in a general manager that at least views Shane Steichen as a potential option for this team moving forward. Albert Breer recently reported, I guess, would it be considered a report if you go on television and talk? Is that a report, or is a report something that has to be tweeted out? I don't know if there's a distinction in the language. Either way, Albert Breer claimed that the Colts are looking at an Ian Cunningham potentially, who was with Shane Steichen in Philadelphia, was on the Ravens prior to that. Unfortunately, right now is with the Chicago Bears, and I don't know if that's the right hire. I'm going to try to bring you some names on that maybe as next week, the week after that. We're going to talk about the GM overall, particularly if Ballard gets fired. Point being, that's a digression entirely. Whoever it is that the Colts bring in, they can't just view Shane Steichen as a placeholder and that's it. They have to have some level of faith in him, because you got to give the guy a chance to prove himself if you're going to make the decision to, well, let him prove himself, right? Number 3, and perhaps most importantly of all right now, the Indianapolis Colts need a pivot plan off of Anthony Richardson. This is going to be a topic I come back to quite a few times this offseason. If this dude cannot play the quarterback position in the NFL, you have to give Shane the opportunity to stay afloat. When you have a quarterback playing like Anthony Richardson is, the type of ball that he is playing is the type of ball that gets a coach fired. And the Colts would benefit from having someone behind Anthony Richardson that is young, that can also be developed, and that they could turn to in the case that this thing continues moving in the direction that it's going. Once upon a time, there was a team by the name of the Washington Redskins. They're now known as the Washington Commanders, okay? But they drafted a guy by the name of Robert Griffin III. The same year the Colts had drafted Andrew Luck, okay? And one of the things they did that year that ended up being very smart was they drafted a dude by the name of Kirk Cousins. And what was it, the 3rd or the 4th round that year, okay? And while Robert Griffin was clear-cut the guy, right? You drafted him with the number 2 overall pick. I'm talking about Washington, that is, that year. At the end of the day, they had something to pivot off of just in case. And that wasn't like some sort of dig at RG3, okay? Now, I don't know if it rubbed them the wrong way or not, but ultimately, when you make a decision like that, if a guy is the guy, he's going to be the guy, regardless of the type of things you put him through, okay? Like, unless it is complete and utter disaster. But if a little bit of competition behind the guy in terms of legitimate competition to be the guy that we build around, if that is enough to send the guy into shambles, then he was never your guy to begin with. And that proved to be a very good decision for Washington. Listen, it's not like Kirk Cousins or RG3. It's not like either of them ended up being the franchise quarterback of that team. But when you look at how things played out with RG3, they were certainly far better off to have had Kirk Cousins than to have not, okay? So that's something that the Colts probably have to look at and say, hey, this situation right now, we have a running quarterback. We're not sure if he can sustain what he's doing, whether it be due to a poor completion percentage, injuries, et cetera, poor work ethic, whatever it is that we want to talk about, the speculative things, okay? The list goes on and on. There's more than enough reasons here to look and say the Colts need somebody else next year just in case. That doesn't have to be in the form of a first-round pick. I have one idea right now. Oh, it's such a good idea in the world. I am going to give you some great ideas this offseason, okay? But this idea right here maybe stands above them all. It's a pipe dream for me personally in the sense that the Colts won't do it. But if you're talking about something that they can do and do relatively easily if they wanted to make it happen, this idea is, this brain sometimes knows absolutely no limits. But regardless of the fact, that's kind of what we had to talk about today. I will see you soon. Hopefully you had a wonderful New Year's Eve. Hopefully it's a happy, healthy New Year for you. Hopefully you have some resolutions. But until next time, my name is Justin. This right here was the Ride on the Bench Colts podcast. And as always, go Colts.